Besides astronomy, I also enjoyed studying anthropology and archaeology when I was a kid. Learning how humans evolved, learning to make and use tools, and went from being nomadic to stationary with the discovery of agriculture were just a few of the things that fascinated me. But how do astronomy and archaeology intersect? I got the opportunity to speak with Dr. E.C.Krupp, the acting director of the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles and an internationally recognized expert in the field of archeoastronomy. I asked him to give me a definition of archaeoastronomy, and I was not disappointed.
First, it is a word with far too many vowels. Second, it is a coined term that eventually became used to refer to the study of ancient, prehistoric, and traditional astronomy in their cultural contexts. And so that really means it's a study of just about any interaction or relationship you might imagine that people might have with the sky. It has focused on, at times at least, ancient monuments and alignments and things like that. But now it kind of falls under the broad category of cultural astronomy. That might even be a synonym for it. But it is, in that sense, all about the relationship of the sky and culture or astronomy and culture.
I'd always known that astronomy played a part in ancient history, but what was its real importance? Why is it important to understand its role in our cultural development?
I think from my perspective, um, it provides an opportunity, limited to be sure, to enter the belief systems of our ancestors and therefore get a hint, at least, of how we came to be the way we are. That's a valuable thing, just in the sense that any kind of self knowledge is useful. You really do want to know the foundations of human experience in order to evaluate in any given moment the most basic of questions. What's the right thing to do? And that could be any right thing, from interactions with individual people to the affairs of a nation. And so having a solid sense of what we are as a species, how culture works, how in fact that's developed, evolved over time, is absolutely essential information for making informed decisions about ourselves. Now, we don't just all do that as individuals, of course, that would be impossible. But that is, in fact, why we have the specialization of knowledge and understanding that we do, that we rely on some people to know, how to design nuclear reactors, some people to know how to design airplanes. And with that comes, of course, people who know how to observe the universe and extract information from it. And some of that information provides human perspective. Some of it may turn out to be very practical, just in terms of understanding how a particular object works, like an asteroid coming our way. So the range is very broad, and I don't mean to imply that any one person engaged in this kind of activity somehow has a mastery of everything we need to know. But in the broad sense, I think that this falls into the category of the assembled cultural understanding that we have of ourselves is a valuable tool for survival.
It sounds like archaeoastronomy actually kind of goes hand in hand with anthropology.
Certainly, certainly does. And there are those who have argued that if you're going to teach this, say as a specific course somewhere, that it probably belongs under the umbrella of the anthropology departments, just as things like archaeology and ethnobotany and other related or perhaps parallel kinds of endeavors work. Normally, we wouldn't even ask that question because it would have already been sorted out from the gradual refinement of our academic systems. But archaeoastronomy as something that is sort of a thing that people actually talk about is relatively recent. And it began very much as a multidisciplinary conversation. So it involved, at the start, of course, astronomers, but archaeologists, anthropologists, art historians, architects, and those are just the A's in the alphabet. You have all kinds of other people who had specialties or areas of interest that touched on the same kind of aspects of the world around us. And so, if you can imagine any activity, any human activity in which the sky plays some kind of role, whether it's very concrete or highly symbolic, uh, then there's a connection there. So you had this multidisciplinary conversation going that was valuable, and I'm talking starting really in the 1960s. It was very valuable because you had all of these individual specializations, individual people bringing their particular knowledge to the table. So it wasn't who you knew that was important, and it wasn't what you knew that was important. It is what who you know knows is important. You really need to be disabused of your ignorance in areas that might, in fact, be helpful to you. And that's why a range of specializations uh, were the people coming to the conferences, and you would have this great diversity of interest, experience, and activity, and learn things that you would otherwise probably never encounter because they were outside of both your training and your normal everyday work activities. That's very nice, in fact, for the development of an inquiry. In fact, I think it's essential in this case. But at the same time, it's very hard for that to then be something that falls into a specific category. But I think you nailed it when you said it. Gee, that sounds a lot like anthropology. And for the most part, it is. It has been a fundamental element of human experience far, far deeper in time than we normally ever consider. We obviously don't have evidence that's concrete and specific to allow us to conclude exactly what our Paleolithic, Upper Stone Age ancestors were doing. But it is hard very much to imagine that they didn't pay attention to the sky because the sky revealed to them things that mattered. And what matters most, of course, is seasons. Seasonality is at the core of this. And whether people have a correct physical understanding of the earth and the sky is not actually relevant at that point. What they need to know is what are the connections that they can see and read that enable them to anticipate what's likely to happen in order to make a good decision for themselves. And you spotlighted just a moment ago two perfect examples of it. One, the era where people are nomadic, hunters and gatherers for that matter. Those people aren't acting randomly and by chance. The California Indians were called, and I think correctly regarded as hunters and gatherers, but they systematically harvested the landscape. They didn't farm because they didn't need to. It was California after all. But they did in fact understand their environment, and that came from looking at all of the clues that are around them. And the sky provides some of those clues that are absolutely unerring and particularly easy to observe from the sky. The seasonality is where you start. And of course, it begins then with the observations of stars that appear and disappear at different seasons. And then, of course, obviously the sun and its behavior migrating with the sunrise migrating or sunset migrating along the horizon north to south in a systematic oscillation that very quickly is realized is tied to what's happening in the environment around us. So it's very hard to imagine that people had to make a living, much as we do, except on a much more fundamental level. 30,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, that they weren't paying attention to these kinds of things. And there are hints that they were, and so that's part of archaeoastronomy too.
I asked Dr. Krupp to provide me some practical examples of what they would study in archaeoastronomy, and he provided a lot of really great stories. Here are some of my favorites.
Well, the story with Stonehenge in the sky very much revolves around the idea that some of those stones are lined up with astronomical events, and in particular, important sunrises or sunsets, or perhaps important moonrises or moonsets. An analysis of the plans of Stonehenge, the placements of these stones, has led people in the past to argue that in fact was going on. And then if you take those alignments seriously, probably the most famous one being the alignment, allegedly, of the summer solstice sunrise with the heel stone, an outlier stone from the main ring, about 300 feet or so from the center of the big stone rings that everybody recognizes. And of course, huge crowds turn out there now. I mean, they drive British Heritage crazy, having to deal with all of those people who feel compelled to assemble at Stonehenge at the summer solstice to watch the sun come up, even if they can't be right on the line to see it happen. Well, from a practical point of view in our own age, that's telling you something right there, that whatever Stonehenge was, it's drawing masses of people now because something is touched in their hearts and their imaginations by the idea of being at a spot where the landscape, the sky, the earth is all doing something that seems to be meaningful, at least to them. Now, archaeoastronomy would probably continue and say, yes, fair enough, but what we really want to know is, was that exactly what was going on at the time? Was it an observatory? Was it a public place? Was it a economic redistribution center? Are those astronomical alignments intentional, or are they the product of chance? And so the study of monuments like that, in part, is intended to see what alignments are there and are they reasonable to attribute to the monument. Well, in the case of Stonehenge, an awful lot has been attributed to that monument, and probably more than you can really accept from the evidence. But the unambiguous parts of it, I think, are the primary axis of Stonehenge. Not so much the sunrise over the heel stone. 5,000 years ago, the heel stone was in place, but the sun didn't rise over it from the center. It was displaced a bit because of slight changes in the orientation and positioning of the Earth's orbit. But it is reasonable to conclude, based on what we know, that the sunrise back then did align with, in fact, the primary original axis of Stonehenge, which involved a couple of stones, not just the heel stone. And it probably aligned both with summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset. Both of those alignments work for the era back in time to which you have to calculate. And then you might say, okay, well, we've got the alignment, but what in the world is this doing? Well, it's not an observatory. You don't need to build giant stones on the plains of Wilshire in order to get those observations. You can do that in a backyard or less, if in fact you dedicate yourself to it. And most of the examples that we have of this as a practical matter where people did that, that's exactly how it worked. Very modest equipment because that's all that's required. A big monument like that is intended to provide a public function, fulfill a public function. And to that function ultimately has to do with the cohesion of that society. So they hold an event that everybody understands that's related to the things going on around them, and other things take place at that time. And archaeologists today have developed more complex interpretations of just what those might be at Stonehenge, and some of them are rather plausible that involve related monuments that are nearby and so on. Those may be very plausible. We're probably never going to get the whole story because most of the past is missing. But that basic idea that an astronomical alignment is built into monumental architecture in order at that place to bond the earth and the sky together for a social, religious, political purpose is in fact what appears to be going on, because we see analogs to that in many other cultures. And just to jump ahead a bit, and I apologize for running on like this, but I think the way that one should look at particularly monumental architecture like this is that these are really miniaturizations of the cosmos. They are symbolic representations, not of how the cosmos looks, but in a way how it works. What, in fact, is important to help indicate that a particular sunrise or a sunset or maybe some other astronomical event is part of the order of the world. And that order is miniaturized into the monument to say that monument is the place, the vehicle for making contact with the greater forces that seem to make the universe around them operate. You see this in ancient China with the emperor in the middle of the imperial palace in Beijing. You see this in for a totally different function in something like the Great Pyramid at Giza, which is a burial chamber, but still intended to make a miniature model of the cosmos in order to facilitate symbolically an idea that puts the ruler and the people in equilibrium with the world around them. Newgrange in Ireland is a monumental passage grave, again, older than Stonehenge, actually, and there is no doubt that it was designed to accommodate the sunrise at winter solstice. There is a special window that is the only place in which that beam of light can enter to make it to the back of the chamber of this so-called grave. And that window contained 2 blocks of quartz when it was excavated. One had fallen out, one was still in. The quartz was examined closely, and you could see from the scrape marks that those little quartz blocks that actually were like window glass were put in, taken out, put in, taken out multiple times. The axis of symmetry of this structure, which is not round, it's closer to heart shape, but its axis of symmetry is oriented to that sunrise, and there are only 3 stones on the curbing outside of Newgrange. 2 of them are opposite each other. That is 3 stones that are decorated. 2 of those stones are decorated with a vertical line in the middle, and those vertical lines of those 2 stones coincide with and mark the axis of symmetry and the direction to that sunrise. So for me, there's no question that the designers were interested in that winter solstice sunrise. And then you say, well, what were they doing there? Well, yes, the remains of the dead, some dead, probably particularly honored dead, were placed there. But that doesn't make it a grave. It's a place, again, large enough for assembly. Well, what kind of assembly? Well, we haven't a clue. All we know is that it's related to the seasonality and, of course, the political structure of that new Stone Age society that marshaled all its resources to build it. By its size, we know it fulfilled a huge public function. By its seasonality, we understand that it had something to do with the sky and the earth connection. And by its connection with the dead, we might imagine that that has something to do as well with transcendent existence of one sort or another. So is this a metaphor for the revival of the year at the winter solstice? And the tomb is Mother Earth and she's fertilized by the sun? Or is it something else? Well, we're not going to know that ever. We're just not going to know. But what we can know is our prehistoric ancestors 5,000 years ago paid attention to what the sun is doing over the course of the year and built it into a huge public monument that clearly made a difference to them because it cost them plenty to build it. I think the first advice I would give would be the same I'd give any kind of professional for any kind of inquiry, and that is, don't be seduced just by the romanticism of the material as you've just encountered it. It is romantic. It is very fetching. But the first thing you've got to do is make no assumptions and immerse yourself in the literature. You've got to know what people have said, what they've explored, where they're looking. Don't just go out into the wilderness looking for a rock art panel or a line of stones or something and see whether I can make astronomy out of that. Take a look and see how this inquiry has developed and evolved. What are the important questions? How can you be misled in your interpretations? How can you possibly be guided to a more correct interpretation? The and I make that point because of the way you've asked the question, which is how can an amateur, nothing wrong with an amateur, but how can that person be involved? The way the amateur should be involved is by approaching the problem professionally, taking it seriously, embracing all of the complexities and the nuances, and committing yourself to mastering them in order to make a genuine contribution. And honestly, I have seen lots of people who are not, quote, professional, unquote, go out and look at things and see something that somebody else didn't see. And that's really what's at stake for all of us. We want everybody to be alert, observant, and able to report and analyze critically. So yeah, you can do that, but you have to do it with discipline. And I see a lot of cases where people just imagine they can just go out and I spotted something and oh, I think it's astronomical for this reason. That's not good enough. You've got to master the literature. Who are these people? Where'd they come from? What did they do? How long were they there? What was important to them? Archaeologists know some of this, anthropologists know some of this, historians of religion know some of this. It is a multidisciplinary inquiry, and nobody gets out of it alone.
I'm going to end this video a little bit differently than I did all the others. First, I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Krupp. It was really great getting to talk with him, and if you could see the unedited interview footage, then you would see that I was left speechless with awe with some of the things he said. If you get the opportunity, go out and visit him at the Griffith Observatory. It would definitely be worth it. Also, you should check out his most recent book, Public Astronomy, Los Angeles Style. The next thing I'd like to say is to reiterate what he said. It's not about who you know or what you know, but what who you know knows. And in that vein, I want to issue a challenge to one of my favorite YouTubers. His name is Milo Rossi, more better known as Mini Minuteman, and he is also an archaeologist. And I would like to issue him a challenge to do a video on archeoastronomy. See if he's up to the challenge. You can also check out his book, The Encyclopedia of the Weird and Wonderful. It's on Amazon, which is where I got it from my Kindle app. And it's a really fun read. I highly recommend it. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. And in the words of my favorite astrophysicist, keep looking up.